Hi, I said in an earlier video that I was going to be doing a World War I retrospective on different games that were created, and I'm going to begin that today. But first I wanted to say a brief moment about why we're doing World War I. Most gamers especially consider it to be a particularly boring subject for a war game because basically everybody sat in trenches for 4 years and nothing really moved. And that's not very exciting in war games, but that turns out not to be the case. There are some excellent war games out there on World War I, and World War I is important to us here today simply because it created the world that we live in. Everything from the trench coat to fronts on weather predictions to the modern Middle East are direct outcomes of the First World War. So that's why it's important for us to talk about it a little bit, and also to talk about some of the games that allow us to explore what actually went on. So the first game that we're going to take a look at is one of the earliest ones that was created. This was World War I, a folio game that was published in S&T magazine, issue number 51, back in 1975. And it was the first game to really address the First World War on a strategic level. There was a previous game published by Avalon Hill called 1914, but we're not going to talk about that until later in this video series because we're going to start out with strategic looks at the World War. So this came in this magazine, and you can see that there was an article on it, on World War I, an article on fast carriers, and then the usual features in S&T magazine. So let's move on to the game. Here's the rules. They actually came bound into the magazine, and you had to open the staples and pull it out, which is what we did with this one. And you can see that it's a pretty short set of rules, actually. There's only a few pages here, and sorry, it came out of the magazine, so that's why it's loose. But basically it's this, and then at the very tail end, you know, we get a combat results table and the scenarios and victory conditions and all that. The rules are pretty straightforward, typical war game rules. The big difference in this game was that for the first time they did something called CRPs, or CRIPs they called them, which stands for Combat Resource Points. And basically each nation used these combat resource points for everything from building new units to to conducting offensives and paying the cost and defense as well. So they became a way to track losses, and at the same time, if you ran out of CRPs, suddenly you were in very serious trouble in this game. Let's take a look at the map next. Again, it was a simple map. This was a folio game. S&T went through a period when they were doing small games in the magazine for about 5 issues, and then realized that they weren't very popular. This was one of the better games published in that whole series, and you can see that we have, basically it's centered on the Central Powers. A little bit of France up here in the corner. We got Germany, Austria-Hungary, Serbia, Russia, and then Switzerland, of course, is off limits. Italy was another major ally, and then Bulgaria was a small Central Powers thing, and so was the Ottoman Empire and Romania. This game does not cover the Middle East, so it only covers the European portion of the Ottoman Empire and that particular part of the war. So here's the CRP track up here, and you could accumulate CRPs or you could run out. You know, the different countries are marked as where they start at the beginning of the first of 1914. And when you set up the game, the situation is already that the Germans have conducted the Schlieffen Plan, and now you're getting into combat. They've pretty much already overrun Belgium. The resource markers on the map are actually designed as victory points. So if you occupy these resource markers, you get 5 victory points. Even if they're in your home country, you get 5 victory points for each one that you have. You'll note that the Western Allies, they'll have supply centers, and they'll be marked as a supply center. Same thing for the Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria, Romania, Greece, and Italy. And each one of these solid supply centers is capable of supplying the entire army. The Central Powers have what you might call conditional supply centers, and each one of these has to work with another one in order to supply. So you need to be able to access 2 of them by rail or whatever in order to maintain supply for your armies. The game is published on the army level, so let's take a look at some of the unit counters right now. First of all, we'll put out a British CRP marker so you get a feel for that. Next, we'll put out a British Army. This happens to be the BEF right there. The Typical Italian army, all the units are pretty much the same except for the British. The BEF is a 4-6, and the rest of their armies are 4-4s. Italy's 3-3s. France is 4-3s. The first number is the attack number. The second one's the defense. For our Central Powers comparison, here's the Ottoman Empire. Good on defense, terrible on offense. Here's the Austro-Hungarians. And last but not least, let's get a German army out there so you can take a look at it. Most of the other armies are 2-3s. For example, Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia. I think Serbia is actually 2-4s. I'll see if I can find one here in a minute. Russia and Italy are both 3-3s. The French are better on the attack than they are on the defense. Also an interesting thing. And last but not least, they also can get a tank army if the war goes into 1919, which is a possibility in this game. Now, the idea is that these units face off against each other. And so, for example, we're out here. And this unit would attack that unit at a +1 differential. If you'll remember that combat results table, where I've managed to lose the rules here. What did I do with it? How did that happen? Dang. Anyway, so if you'll remember the combat results table, it's a differential combat results table. So this would be a +1. You then roll a 6-sided die. You get a pair of numbers with a slash between them. First number is the attacker's losses. Second number is the defender's losses. The game actually plays remarkably well. The turns each represent about 6 months, except for the first turn in 1914, which is only about 3 months. And there are multiple attack and phases in each turn. You move your units. Every unit has a movement allowance of 5. You move your units, and then you can also move them by rail. And then you conduct a series of attacks. So you could attack this Russian army 3 times during the turn, if you wish to do so. One interesting kick is that the Russians and the Romanians both suffer double losses when facing the Germans. Everybody else, the losses are normal. But if they face the Germans, they'll lose twice as many CRPs as they would otherwise. And that's basically the course of the game. Your objective, of course, is to capture as many of these resources hexes as you can, and also to drive the Russians out of the war. And you get a certain number of victory points down here on the table, on the turn record chart, if you manage to force them to surrender at a certain point. If you can conquer Russia in the first turn, you get 100 victory points, which means you pretty much won the game. The last thing to factor in is the British blockade, which hurts the Central Powers by costing them a total of 10 victory points at the end of the game. The game plays really fast. There's a surprising amount of movement in it, and it actually simulates the First World War pretty well at a strategic level. It's a lot more fun than I expected it to be. These, by the way, are fortresses, these gray hexes with the numbers in them, and the number indicates how strong the fortress is. In other words, what its combat value is for defense. The only other kick in the thing is the French tank unit and German Stoss armies, if I can find one of them, which hopefully I will here. Well, maybe not. Yeah, here we go. And the German Stoss armies are both able to force a retreat. So you can choose to take casualties by suffering CRPs or by backing off a hex or 2, or however many you need to. And if you run out of CRPs, you have no choice but to retreat, except in the third one when you can allow your army to be destroyed to satisfy the casualties. But with the Stoss and the tank armies, you can force the enemy to retreat 1 hex every time you attack. So that again gives you a feel for how the system works. Like I said, it's actually a pretty fun game, and the bottom line is that it plays quickly. You can play it in an evening. It plays easily on solitaire if you're so desiring to do that, and you also can play multiple things, multiple iterations in order to find out who's better if you're facing off against an opponent. One other thing down here on the turn record chart is this blue strip in here has a list of each country and the number of CRPs that gets that turn. So you'll see that gradually over time, the number of CRPs that each country gets declines dramatically until by 1918, you're in serious trouble if you try to do very much at all. But early on in the war, you can do a lot of fighting. The goal here rapidly becomes attrition. My objective is to get rid of as many of your CRPs as possible so that by the time we get back into 1917 or 1918, I can force you to give up ground or suffer severe losses in the form of an entire army being destroyed. The idea, of course, being that I drive you out of the war, and each country can be driven out individually. So the bottom line is, like I said, excellent game, surprisingly fun, surprisingly mobile, and a lot of nuance in it for a little bitty game like this. This was one of the very first games that ever became, that ever dealt with First World War in a kind of exciting way. You'll note that there's no air power, there's no navies, none of that. Central Powers really didn't have much in the way of ability to interfere in the Mediterranean, and in the North Atlantic, of course, the British main fleet was there, so the Germans were outmatched there as well. So they just basically ignored it for the purposes of this game. Pretty much all the action occurs on the land. They didn't include the Middle East. But, like I said, it was an excellent little game, and it certainly satisfied the requirements for the objective here. The SPI, the original SPI, not the current one, also published a folio version without the magazine, same basic thing. World War I rules. Man, we got 3 copies of them. That's weird. I just got this in the mail not too long ago. Excuse me. The unit counters and the map, and nothing's really changed. Same basic game. It's just that it's published as a folio, so people could separate it, get it cheaper than ordering the magazine. The third version was published by the new SPI, Decision Games, and this was their issue number 294. So it's 243 issues later than the one that we just opened. And there are some changes to this one a little bit. First of all, they changed the way the units are represented a bit. So we have, for example, the U.S. First Army here, and it's given a 5-4. In the original World War I, it was a 4-4. It was pretty standardized. Flip it and it becomes entrenched. They did the back printing. The other counters are not back printed. They also introduced some variations on units. So, for example, the French now have an Alpine Corps, Alpine Corps kind of thing. I believe the Germans do too. They changed the colors a little bit on the Brits. They went to this instead of dark blue. This represents, by the way, a reserve type unit, so it's a little less efficient than an active duty unit. This would be an active duty unit, and so on. There are a number of different markers available. You can create ports and all that sort of thing. It came in the magazine, which this was the magazine, and in this particular case, it's quite a bit thicker than the original magazine was. And they had some articles in here on the subject as well. So basically, you'll see over here their first main article is World War I. They also had an article on Desert Storm, the third system of forts in the American Civil War, and the Muslim conquest of Syria. So quite a variation of articles, typical S&T kind of thing. The quality of the magazine has improved a little bit. It's glossy. It's got much better imagery and mapping, and the usual number of tables and descriptions for everything in the magazine. Setting that aside, though, the rules, once again, were published inside the game, and here you have a list, an example of everything that's going on. You'll note that they use different symbology for the STOS troops. Excuse me. They do have naval and air influence in the game this time. They also have things like mandatory offensives. You can execute certain plans and so on and so forth. So it's quite a bit more complex really than the original one was. It still plays pretty well. It's pretty close to the original. There's just a lot more chrome in it than there used to be. So, and once again, we have the combat results table. Again, take a look. The attacker losses in front of the stroke, and the defender losses afterwards, and the differential is listed here. So you can attack at -1 odds, which you couldn't do in the original one, by the way. And then they have different terrain effects charts and that sort of thing. Supply source description, all that. A bunch of different tables. We have a diplomatic activation table for the neutrals now, instead of them just automatically coming in when they did. We have a Russian Civil War, collapse and surrender checks, all these different things that are now going on. Naval campaign table, strategic attacks so that you can conduct like strategic bombing or whatever. And we have they've changed the title of the CRPs to MP. They're now mobilization points, and there's mobilization costs, but they can still be used for losses just as they were in the original one. And instead of being on the turn record chart, here's the mobilization points by turn, they're modifiers. The way mobilization points are calculated now is you take a look at the map and you add up the number of resource and factory markers that you have, or hexes that you own, and each one of those is worth 5 mobilization points, and then that multiplier talks about the number of mobilization points you can get. So turning it around so you can read it, here's Serbia, for example, now has a mobilization center at Niš, so that's a total of 5 mobilization points times whatever their modifier is, which is probably 1. Austria has done a bunch of different mobilization centers plus some resource centers. They all count the same. If you occupy an enemy mobilization center, you don't get anything for it. If you occupy a resource center, you get 5 mobilization points for it, just as if it were your own. Last but not least, they've added objective hexes. These are hexes that were important to somebody and needed to be taken by that somebody. So, for example, the Italians want Trieste, the Austrians want Venice. If one of them captures their desired objective, then they get 1 extra mobilization point per turn for that objective. It's kind of an interesting way to do it. You'll note the forts have now changed. They actually kind of resemble the ones that were on the map in 1914. So you'll see these little diamonds around there indicating forts around the town. But each fort indicates the number of rings of forts indicates how strong the fortification is. So Peter Warden is a fortress level 1. But if we look over here at Sevastopol, you'll see that it's a fortress level 3. So that's how they differentiated this time around. Another interesting thing they did was they actually did add in the Near East and Middle East. So now we have Jerusalem, Aleppo, Tiflis in the Russian Empire, Mosul, which is definitely important, Abadan, which is definitely important for mobilization points, and so on. So these kind of give you a feel for how the game has now expanded quite a bit. They've also added core level units and so on and so forth to provide for the smaller forces that actually fought in the Near East and the Middle East. The other thing is that they include off-map mobilization centers. So if you look over here at the Russian Empire, you'll see that they've got 2 off-map factories, which means that even if they lose everything on the map, they in fact still have 10 mobilization points coming in per turn. The Ottoman Empire has some as well. 1 extra factory that's off-map. One interesting thing, if I can find it, is the Germans. Oh, don't see it on this one. They must have added that later. Okay. Anyway, so now you get a feel for how the game works. There's a number of holding blocks. The map's actually pretty well designed. It still covers everything that the original map does. They cut off a little bit of Italy that never really comes into play, but you could still take Rome. And that's basically, they've upgraded the accuracy of the fortifications, for example. So now there's fortifications along the Serbian border, which weren't there before. And again, you get a feel for how strong the fortification levels were along the French border, which explains why the Germans went through Belgium to get into France. So that was the revised edition, the upgraded one that they published in the magazine in, gosh, I can't remember when they published it. Let's see, here's the magazine. It was September, October of 2015 is when this one came out. So keep in mind, the first one was published in 1975, so that's quite a few years later that they did this, and they actually made the game different. It's still pretty much the same game, but there's a lot more chrome on it now, and there's a lot of extra stuff to deal with, and there was some debate as to whether or not it actually improved it or not. It certainly made it more complex. The last version of this game that I'm going to show you is something that they published a couple of years ago, Deluxe World War I. It's a box set this time around. And we have the Deluxe World War I edition from Decision Games. The rules, they've made the graphics on the rules quite a bit better. It's a little easier to read than it was in the magazine. They've provided some examples of play, which is really nice, always very helpful when you're trying to do this stuff. Note that the numbers have changed. The typical German army is still a 4-6, but now the Stoss armies are 6-4s. They flip numbers, if you will. But they're the ones that can do the successful attacking and drive it out. They provided a centerfold that actually shows what the deployments are supposed to be and also can be used as a planning map. So it gives you some idea of that. They have special rules for special units, transit areas, and so on and so forth. How do you get Ottoman troops to the Ottoman Empire? And let's see, there's special rules for no man's land and various other things. And at the tail end, this time around, they also provided some designers and players' notes for the game, which is also very useful to most players. In the original one, there's some players' notes somewhere in the game or the magazine, but very basic, very basic. This goes into quite a bit more detail on what players can and cannot do and what they need to think about when they're planning how to play this game. But basically, it's the same game that was published in the magazine with a little bit more stuff. I got this one fairly recently, so I haven't punched it yet. But here's an actual view of the unit counters. You can get a feel for just how much it's changed over the years. 4-6s, garrison units are 2-4s, some reserve, these corps, these little reserve corps, and so on, Stoss troops. We have British tank armies now, not just a French one. We also have a French tank army. We also have a U.S. tank army. So you get a feel for how the numbers look. The numbers have changed a little bit. Serbia is still 2-4s, but Romania has dropped to 2-2 instead of 2-3. Italy's still 3-3s, and so on. The Ottoman Empire's forces have gotten quite a bit bigger in terms of number of units. Before you had 2 units for the Ottomans. Now you've got quite a few more. And Austria stayed about the same, but they've got a couple of extra. They've changed the designation on some of these units and provided a couple of corps as well. Again, excuse me. The markers include, like I said, naval markers, tactical air markers, plan markers, so that you can designate an area for a planned offensive, which gives you some advantages, but also some disadvantages. You also notice that the Germans now have a Royal Navy Army, which is kind of interesting. The Brits have a Royal Navy unit as well over here. And they're both pretty weak, but they're designed as, to represent naval troops pulled from the Navy. We can build depots and so on and so forth now, which is necessary with the addition of the Middle East game. So again, it gives you a feel for how the units have changed a little bit. The map in this game is pretty much the same thing that was on the map in the magazine, except one, it's hardback. It's a mounted map, which is always nice. But then it is a deluxe edition of the game, so it should be nice, right? So see how it unfolds here a little bit. So one of the things I wanted to show, though, was some of these off-map boxes again. So, don't need this section of the map here. All right, so again, taking a look at these off-map boxes, you'll see the British Empire has quite a few extra factories, and the U.S. Industrial production is all off-map, of course, because they don't appear on this map, and the French have some imperial resources as well. One thing is that in this particular case, note the blockade in effect. Okay, if the blockade's in effect, then you run with what's on the map. But if the blockade is not in effect, Germany gets 2 extra mobilization centers and Austria-Hungary gets 1. Effectively, what they're saying is that raw materials, food, and everything is coming in just as it would normally. So the Brits have a decision to make as to whether or not they're going to blockade, and that affects diplomacy. So that'll anger the Americans and possibly delay their entry. So the things that you need to think about is the Allied player. The distance, by the way, for each hex is about 30 miles across. The scale has not changed over the course of the entire game. But again, the only difference between this and the one that was in the magazine map-wise is the fact that it's mounted, which is a nice plus. So how does this one play? Don't know, haven't played it, but the magazine game plays fairly close to First World War. There's a little bit more complexity involved. You're juggling a few more variables than you were in the original game. But overall, all the games represent the First World War very well. They're fairly exciting, which is a plus for a World War I game. And at the same time, they managed to show you what was going on in the First World War and give you a feel for some of the things that did happen at the strategic level. Okay. So again, this is not going to be your tactical, game or your operational level game where divisions are fighting. This is army level stuff. And you go through the whole war pretty quickly. Admittedly, the deluxe version takes probably about 2 to 3 times as long as the original game back in 1975 did to play, because there are so many variables and so many extra things that you need to worry about during the turn. But overall, they all play well, and the fact of the matter is you can learn a lot about how the First World War started, evolved, and finished, and some of the consequences that resulted from it by playing these games, which is always a plus. Next video, we're going to talk about another strategic level game. In fact, we've got a total of 4 strategic level games that we're going to go through over the course of the next few videos. And then we're going to switch to operational, and we'll finally finish out with tactical games later on down the road. So this will be a somewhat lengthy group of videos, and I hope you enjoyed this one. If you did, please don't forget to like and subscribe. We can always use the support. Thanks so much for your time.